factory is like 200 yards from here. Yes, stay connected. Yeah.
So the recording is started, and we should start here. It's 3 p.m. Anyway, first of all, I'm Francis Remedios. I'm the chair of this panel, and I want to welcome everybody to the panel. So the order is going to be this: is that Bob Frodeman is going to speak first for 15 minutes. Elsie Malapai Nelson will speak for another 15. I'll speak for 15, and C. Fuller will speak, and then we'll have a half hour for questions. So, Bob, do you want to start? And then in terms of the chat, people can write the questions on the chat, and we'll answer the questions in the half hour.
All right, my turn?
Yes.
All right. Greetings from the wilds of Wyoming. I'm doing a screen share, or I'm trying to. Is that successful?
Yeah.
Yep.
Excellent. It's a pleasure being here, though I wish I was in Toronto. I've had enough of these virtual conferences at this point, as I bet all of you have as well. I should be able to run through this in 15 minutes or less. I'm interested in the future of the university, or more generally, the future of knowledge. I've enjoyed an ongoing debate with Steve Fuller over the years about this. It's a pleasure that we have so many diametrically opposed positions. I wrote a book that came out in 2019 on transhumanism, that the first draft of it is a 3,500-word essay, was titled Anti-Fuller. And so in some sense, this little presentation continues our debate, at least on my side. So I want to talk about the last of the handcraft industries, STS, and the post-COVID university. There's going to be three parts to this. I'm going to talk about the origins of modern research university, and then the status quo ante, but quite ante, I mean just before COVID, and then turn to the future of the university. And I want to briefly contrast, I want to present a point of view by contrasting it with Michael Crow, president of Arizona State University, who styles himself as a theoretician of the new American university. So that's the agenda. Okay, first, the MRU, the Modern Research University. It's a curious, understudied history, in my opinion. There is a relative paucity of work on the subject, though there's some work out there, of course. But I mean more specifically that we inhabit this space, but we do not make a reflexive turn thinking about this space that we inhabit. A class on the university, the nature of the college university, should be part of general education requirements and a course for every PhD in every discipline, STS and chemistry both. It, of course, is not now. Among academics, there's a really curious lack of reflexivity, since humanists, STSers, philosophers, love the reflexive turn. Undergraduates spend 4 years or so in this institution. They should become more self-aware of its nature. Of course, that's true double and triple for folks like us who may spend 30 or 40 years within this institution. Instead, the modern research university is treated as some kind of natural or neutral environment for the flowering of knowledge, when of course that's not true at all. It's not true of any institution, and it certainly isn't true of this relatively recent institution, the Modern Research University. The whole point reminds me of Upton Sinclair's comment about how difficult it is to get a man to understand something when the salary, or perhaps better said in this case, his or her self-interest depends on not understanding it. There's a certain willful blindness that operates. People, those who manage to join the professorate, have it good. They go about their business. It's a luxurious lifestyle. I know we all bitch about the administrivia that we increasingly have to do, but still, my goodness, it is a privileged lifestyle, and people don't want to delve too deeply in its presumptions and presuppositions. We might disturb something. The history of this institution, we could talk about the University of Berlin in 1811, but I think a better place to mark its real start as a societal institution is Johns Hopkins, founded in 1876, which abandoned the assumptions of the medieval university and the American colonial college. What were those assumptions? I want to highlight two of them. First, that this was an essentially conservative institution, the medieval university or the colonial college, that our cultural legacy can be broken in one generation. There was a general thoroughgoing Burkean attitude toward this, that we need to pass this down generation to generation. Knowledge, the development of new knowledge was not something eschewed, but there was no real emphasis upon it. Second, there was training in noblesse oblige. Of course, how well that would take in any given case is open to question. But if you take the American Colonial College, for instance, or the American College in 1835, someplace like Amherst, typically the college president would teach the final course, a capstone course in moral philosophy, where there would be a kind of gathering together of what's been learned over the years, and then and a kind of focus on the kind of future profession someone would be inhabiting, which in most cases would be something like teaching, or the clergy, or a law degree, or perhaps medicine. Excuse me. Certainly not the kind of technical education that we've become accustomed to in the last 75 or 100 years. So if we want to talk briefly about drivers of this change, industrialism was supercharged in the aftermath of the Civil War in the US, and universities were tasked with providing the epistemic underpinnings of industrial capitalism. All right, so I want to highlight two assumptions of the MRU. First, knowledge production is considered an infinite project. That's tacitly understood, never raised as an issue, and certainly never questioned. Second, knowledge is treated as flat. No type of knowledge is more fundamental than or considered to be superior to any other. The first point necessitated the creation of disciplines, or perhaps we should better say disciplinarity, a philosophy of external relations, which led to the development of specialized expertise in departments and majors. Remember that in the colonial college, or in the medieval or the 16th, 17th century European university, there were no majors. And all these different disciplines operated and still operate as a philosophy of external relations. It was assumed that things can be understood in isolation from the larger world. Think about the classic understanding of how the lab experiment works. The second point, the flatness of knowledge, means that there is no end to knowledge in both senses. There is no end in the sense of a terminus, and there is no end in the sense of a purpose. This is why Heidegger, in his essay Question Concerning Technology, defined us as living in a technological age, and argued that technology actually precedes science. That is, the mindset of providing a means without talking about ends. With Locke, ends were privatized after all, and were left as essentially irrational, now there is no end. It's a kind of what Hegel calls a bad infinity. Still today, the MRU has a flat structure. There is no unit on campus that asks about the whole of knowledge. Well, okay, administrators in a really dopey sense, they do, but there's no think tank that sits at as a kitchen cabinet to a provost or president. And certainly philosophy has abdicated this role. Right, so we are in a situation where at the MRU you can study ecology while the very structure of knowledge is itself anti-ecological, an epistemic version of Tina being there is no alternative to the market. You can't plan anything. We just let capitalism grow and assume or hope for the best. Similarly, we allow epistemic capitalism to fructify and assume that all this knowledge will somehow add up to a benign outcome. This highlights the fateful decision of philosophy and the humanities around the year 1900 to become another regional ontology like chemistry or physics or economics or something. William James bitterly protested this to no avail. And STS has fallen into the same disciplinary trap increasingly over the last few decades. Okay, status quo ante. How many jobs are there that are the same as 50 years ago? Well, ours are, we still make our own syllabuses, stand in front of groups of students, we publish papers, most of which are never read or cited. And somehow we have this kind of forgetfulness that until COVID, what was this gig of running around the world or the country, visiting lectures or attending conferences? This is a really recent phenomenon. My professors in the 70s would go to one conference a year, which was driving distance. And so with COVID, all this has been upset, has been overturned, and the question is, will past conditions return, or will administrators and legislatures make use of this disruption? So let's consider two possibilities here. The first from Mike Crow, what you could call woke neoliberalism. Let me read this. A league of colleges, this is from the beginning of his book, a league of colleges and universities, spearheaded by him, initially by a subset of large-scale public research universities, read ASU, unified in their resolve to accelerate positive social outcomes through the seamless integration of world-class knowledge production with cutting-edge technological innovation and institutional cultures dedicated to the advancement of accessibility to the broadest possible democratic representative. Diversity plus neoliberalism. Consider the buried assumptions here. First, this is higher education meeting Ray Kurzweil in the singularity. We need more. Crow is arguing for more and an accelerating acquisition of knowledge. Consider that this is a kind of cryptic transhumanism. Second, it assumes a significant untapped cohort of 18-year-olds who have the ability and the desire for such an education and an economy that will absorb this cohort. And finally, it assumes a set of human needs that are infinite, that need satisfying. And the question we are not asking, are needs infinite, or should they be treated as such? Can't we distinguish between necessities and luxuries, between clean water and sanitation, and the newest app for our phone? Evidently not. I think that Crow's vision is a monument to the past. It reflects an impoverished philosophical anthropology, this infant desire which leads to madness and sadness, and an errant ecological outlook. It has democratic assumptions rooted in the Enlightenment, and if everyone would like to become educated, I think recent political history, especially in the United States, suggests that, whether we're talking about Trump or vaccines, suggests that these assumptions have been shown to be erroneous. I would speak with Plato about gold, silver, and bronze. Crow also assumes that the combination of ever more possible technologies will always be benign, and he treats ecological limits as always susceptible to some type of technological fix. Whereas I suspect a different future, where the handcraft nature of the academy becomes marginalized and downsized. There are currently 2,500 four-year and more institutions in the United States. I suspect we will see a radical drop in that number, and we should be thinking, what does this mean but for academic jobs, and also for diversity of opinion? If the few jobs that are out there all come up, people out of Stanford and Harvard. I also suspect that humanities, and I include STS here, knowledge production, will be severely curtailed just by not hiring those folks. And so the question that I would like to end with is, what kind of proactive steps can the STS community take to think through and get in front of these possibilities? Thank you. All right, let me stop sharing the screen. Is there anybody still there?
Okay, well, thank you, Bob. And we have Elsie Malapai Nelson next.
Hello, guys. Good to have you here, even if it's virtually only. Perhaps next time in Europe, let's hope. So what I want to talk to you about is a little bit an extension of what I've been doing for a while, which is the consequence of emerging technologies in society in general, in this case, applying it to education. The title of this little presentation is Automation in Academia. So in what way emerging technologies are going to collaborate towards making education more automatic, and in which ways we can probably deal with this. Okay, so that is the context, focusing mostly on artificial intelligence, but also man-machine interfaces, human-machine interfaces, all within part of the so-called NBIC agenda: nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science. How this is going to pan out in education. This comes from my own experience so far, but of course I'm influenced probably mostly by Professor Fuller's work, I have to say, up front. I see that it is related to what Bob has been saying, so there are points of agreement there and points of disagreement as well. So a little bit of context in terms of history. In that, Bob kind of helped me out. I will just say briefly, quickly, how education was and where is it that we're going to, and the kind of challenges that we have now. If there's any question, especially the other attendees, regarding references, you can contact me on what I put in my profile. You have there my email, my Twitter, my webpage. You can ask me later for references. So in the medieval times, we have the invention of the university in Europe, 12th, 13th century. Professor Fuller has written about the types of the different nuances that the universities had, the Dominican versus the Franciscan style. And what Bob said applies. It was mostly philosophy, law, and theology. There were no specialization of anything. That changes a little bit in the Reformation. Elizabeth Eisenstein has written at length about this. The role of colleges offering what Catholic universities were not offering. They were more stuck in philosophy, theology, and the law being perhaps the most empirical of them all, and colleges doing the interesting stuff, following the scientific revolution into technology, into science, basically natural philosophy, tinkering with things. So the interesting stuff in that realm, in that respect, was happening outside universities. Okay, and colleges began to put that as something of a priority, which Elizabeth Einstein, she documented very well. Later on, this happens obviously after the Reformation. We're talking 15th, 16th century Europe. Later on, we have the situation of the German monarchies a little bit scattered, trying to get better in educating the population after catching up for decades, if not centuries, after France and Britain mostly, perhaps Spain to some extent. Prussia gets into the forefront of a new model of education, reunifying back, putting back together the arts that were kept in the Catholic universities and the sciences that were developed in the Protestant colleges. We're talking about, of course, Wilhelm von Humboldt, this notion of a Bildung, where the citizen has a mature knowledge, where the person is autonomous in his decisions, something that the university should do. And he puts it together by reintegrating arts and sciences, and both also research and education. So both teaching and doing research, he puts them together as kind of a condition for this knowledge that you are acquiring. You have to teach it as well, you have to pass it over. That catapulted Germany, the nations, monarchies of the time, at the forefront of education, and later, as a matter of fact, other universities follow, both in Europe and the United States. We're talking there around, probably 18th, 19th century. And then we have in the 20th century challenge to this. Okay, we have neoliberalism, about which Professor Fuller writes in the Academic Caesar, challenging this model. The economic emphasis is shifted from production to the consumer. The market begins to dictate what is needed, and this pressure erodes the Humboldtian model I just talked about. Now we begin to have extreme specialization, so the opposite of what Bob was talking about happening in the Catholic universities. Now the opposite is the case. In order to satisfy these market needs, we need to have extreme, profound specialization. And that begins to erode communication between fields. People begin to have different jargons, different nomenclature for basically the same content. Cybernetics, for example, something that I studied in depth, was a clear attempt in overcoming this, in countering this. The 10 Macy conferences was an attempt by Norbert Rinder, says that thing clearly. He noticed that these guys were talking about the same thing with different words. Okay, so this specialization takes away big thinking, having the big picture. Also divides, separates research and teaching. We have them now not fused as Humboldt would want. And that creates a crisis in a university, and of course in colleges as well. So that probably is the picture that we can say is happening nowadays. As a consequence of this, we have universities putting emphasis on things that are, for example, research that is not necessarily teachable, and on the other hand, colleges just teaching traits a little bit hollow, without a big picture, without critical thinking. As an outcome of these two situations, we have cases that now we can hear on the news more and more often. Firms, software firms, accounting firms, law firms that are skipping the need for students to get prepared in universities. Okay, they would provide an education that is more specialized to their own needs. Okay, they would just need a certain, intelligence, probably above average intelligence, and they will form you. So skipping the middleman, basically, and the middleman here being colleges or universities. And of course, that's a situation that raises the question whether or not there is a human value in certain positions that are considered as well blue collar, like nursing, for example. What would be the added human value of having a human nurse as opposed to a robotic nurse, which is something that Professor Fuller has spoken in the past. That is an interrogation mark. Maybe, we'll have to pay more for these kind of situations. We don't know. Any questions so far, or we'll leave the questions for the end, Francis? For the end? Okay. So another outcome of this is that emerging technologies are creating a kind of strange situation for educators, where it's pushing educators to make the delivery of knowledge a more mechanizable thing, a more put it in a commoditized way. When you have PowerPoints, when you have presentations and slides, and you merely read them, students now, without fear, they tell you why to even attend. You can just send these things for a student to read. So it would seem that professors themselves are kind of preparing themselves for the replacement in a way that is happening now. I mean, we have a couple of cases I want to share with you. In 2017, we went to our last strike here in Ontario. All the colleges are under the same union. And the person who was in charge of the corporation that dealt with us, Don Sinclair, he said, he didn't have a problem in saying that he didn't want to commit to anything, because in the near future, he was seeing an automatization of academia, right? The possibility of replacing us, right? And if that is not enough for you to accept that is coming, maybe you heard in the news that in Montreal, in Concordia, where I completed my master's degree, this year, at the beginning of this year, there was a professor that was teaching after death, right? This professor, the Concordia University was using his notes as instructional tools, and the students were, with passion, emailing the professor, okay, trying to, talk with them and all that. So there was a kind of an uncanny situation happening there when the university revealed that the guy was dead, right? Of course, it raises issues of copyright and all that, but what I'm trying to say here is that it would seem that academia itself is preparing itself in order to be automatized, okay? As well, in terms of research, more and more, there is this pressure of writing in such a way that could be machine readable, okay? Not only from the point of view of putting the certain keywords in certain places, but the structure of the sentences themselves, so that search engines like Google can read them properly, so that your paper, your abstract, or whatever you're writing comes up when the person does the right search, right? Up to these 5 to 10 years, and perhaps it wouldn't be out of the realm of the imagination, machines writing things themselves, right? Or helping the scholar in writing in such a way that you begin to wonder to what extent we are needed, right? So it is affecting both teaching itself, as commoditizing what we do, instead of teaching in class the procedure in order to reach the solution, what Humboldt would like us to do. Instead of that, especially the outcome-based institutions, will just give the solution, just a knowledge transfer, right? Anybody can do that, and that anybody cannot necessarily be human, right? A perfect example of this case is when Professor Fuller talks about these cybernetic textbooks, people that merely comment on points in a PowerPoint slide, right? And sometimes not much commentary, actually. It's just reading, right? We have witnessed professors who just sit down and begin to read the slides out loud, right? I might as well hire a person to read it for them. And the students are saying it. They are waiting for the other shoe to drop. They just tell you, now they can tell you to your face, you guys are going to be replaced, and they are right. At least this type of education. So that's kind of the situation in which we are now. What to do about it? I will be proposing a couple of just humble suggestions here. Probably to build a conversation here, probably to make more research about it, write about it. I don't know. This is what I would say, what I would propose. First of all, we have two options: the precautionary one that Bob loves, that's his thing, and we have Fuller's, and to some extent mine. I would say to a great extent mine, but not all the way. The proactionary one, which in my position, in my humble opinion, has to do with the very essence of modern science, by the way. So the precautionary one would be, okay, we have to stop neoliberalism and we have to stop AI. Okay, neoliberalism is bad for education. In any case, most professors will be okay with that. There's a lot of backup regarding this idea, this kind of lefty idea that neoliberalism is evil, and AI has to be curtailed somehow. Okay, both these two forces, to block them somehow, to hold them, to slow them down, as the precautionary model would dictate, I would say that they are not only unrealistic. It's not going to happen, really. Okay, neoliberalism is not going anywhere, and AI is not stopping. Okay, but also might be wrong. Neoliberalism can be a good antidote within all these limitations, and the scary things that come out of it, against what people, Professor Fuller included, call academic rentiership. Okay, peer review as a limitator of communication, as a assessment and affirmation of discipline identity. Okay, as opposed to conversation between fields. And as a matter of fact, as we can see from the two world wars, from the Cold War, from and now COVID, probably the champion here of this view will be Warren Weaver. Interdisciplinary is needed, okay, for the needs of not only a state but society at large, right? So that, if we disagree with that, then we have a problem. Okay, because that I would take as a given. That interdisciplinary is needed in order to have real innovation. Okay, and peer review and academic rentership goes against that. Okay, in diametrically opposed way. So probably it's not a good idea to say no to neoliberalism completely. Okay, so there might be something positive about it. What about AI? Let's put it this way. AI now is embedded as models of engineering in a lot of research. Okay, we're not talking about machines doing things by themselves or self-consciousness. We're talking about models that help reasoning faster. We're talking about computational processes that can be done in a quicker. Okay, mRNA, what we now use for vaccines, happened after 50 years of research, and there was a lot of AI involved in the later years, anyways. Okay, without it, probably we wouldn't have it now. We would have just Johnson and Johnson and AstraZeneca. So it is not only probably wrong and unrealistic, but AI might be our partner, might be our ally if we do it right. Okay, one of the reasons why Elon Musk wants to now interface instead of fighting them. Right. So the precautionary approach wouldn't go. So what would be the alternative? How much time I have? 2 minutes, right? The proactionary approach. The proactionary approach is more friendly to risk. Puts emphasis not on the dangers that came from the past and the possible, negative outcomes, but rather on the opportunities and possibilities that we might open up out of, a thinking that happens out of the box. So it is more friendly with risk. Under a proactionary attitude, I would propose a couple of things. First, a return to a Humboldtian model, so that we can put back into education things that we're losing. under the pressure of giving this outcome-based kind of learning. Once again, what is needed to give is a critical mind and a creative mind, not only to resolve problems in class, see the process, but also to be competitive, okay? Because these AI agents are going to be there in order to take something that is repetitive, something that can be automated, okay? However, AI is not that good yet, anyhow, probably for the next 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years in creative thinking and in critical thinking. So whereas the paralegal might be is replaced already, the accountant is being replaced by software companies built in Toronto now, what is never going to be replaced is the lawyer fighting in court, for example. The guy who is using rhetoric, is using his Jesuitic formation, is using philosophy, is using stuff, improvisation in order to fight a case. That machines are not going to do anytime soon. And that we have to put back into the minds of students, okay? PowerPoint learning goes, basically, there's a professor called Nicholas Carr that has research on this. It disables the person cognitively. He claims to have evidence of this, all the way to people dying, okay? In the military, they like PowerPoint and people die, okay? After all, you all know Harari, the guy who writes Deus Homo Deus and all this. He says that now the thing to study is philosophy. Is the most useful thing to study in the future. He refers to philosophy applied to pretty much everything, to have this critical mind and creative mind. What Humboldt put at the basis of his formation back in the day, right? And the last thing, and with this I finish, to not hire people who come from companies like Pepsi or General Motors who take educations as epistemic units that can be treated as, for like wheels or things, that understands the intrinsicality of education as an intrinsic good, to put them as managers of universities and give them a lot of prestige, as opposed to, failed academicians that have as a consolation reward a well-remunerated position as a manager. It shouldn't be that. It perhaps should be a person who is an educator, accomplished with managerial skills, and probably certified at that. Okay? Those would be the two pro solutions that I would put. And they are not entirely original. One of them at least comes from Professor Fuller. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Elsie. So I'm next. I'm Francis Medios, an independent scholar. So the title of my paper, I've changed a bit. I just added a question mark to the end of the title, which is the University and the Knowledge as a Public Good, question mark, right? So what I'm going to do is going to talk about several issues here, different models of the public good and innovation from outside the university, and then what's going to happen to the university with all these issues here. So there are many challenges to university, finding epistemic authority, and is one of the questions of the problems the changing notion of knowledge as a public good. And I break it out to two questions here. Is knowledge as a public good produced at universities? Is knowledge for the public good produced at universities? Now, these two questions are frame how to look at knowledge produced at universities very differently. Question one is a political economic notion of knowledge produced at universities as a public good, and the political economic notion is that knowledge has been espoused or supposed to be a public good at university, produced at universities, but what is that notion here? That is more of a notion that a public good is something that costs less to provide for free than to restrict access, right? And public goods arise out of market failure. So the government has to provide, or the state has to provide these public goods because the market's not going to provide them. Now, question two is more of a societal notion of knowledge produced at universities for the public good, in the sense that it benefits the whole of society, and this emphasizes the public part of the public good, right? and it's more of a democratic notion of knowledge as a public good. So these two questions are currently interwoven, and they're not easily separated with the crisis of universities and with neoliberalism as well. There are also a couple other issues here, access issues in terms of people accessing universities, and because of costs, et cetera, and also intermingled with these two questions is also knowledge is considered to be a commodity which can be traded and has market value. Now, so then the question is, how did the university become responsible to produce knowledge as a public good? Well, Elsie talked about Humboldt, and yes, I mean, Alexander von Humboldt was the one who brought about the notion of research universities to produce knowledge for the public good. And then the German state became involved in terms of universities to fund universities, produce knowledge for as a public good. But then further on, the state, gave the universities funding, but then the universities adopted power in terms of, in terms of that funding to decide what they wanted to do with that funding and to have academic disciplines. And then the academic disciplines decided what is knowledge, right? And then, so these are sort of several issues in terms of the background here. Now, and then the peer review process was set up. Process with academics decides now what knowledge is of the public good. So in terms of sort of a couple of models, right, in the past anyway, or at least one model in the past was the social democratic model. And that was more of a Keynesian model where before the 60s, very few people went to university. And those people who went to university, some of those people became scientists, and they were the ones who produced knowledge for the public good. Now, the other model is neoliberalism, right? And that model is that scientific knowledge has to be made as a public good with the knowledge economy and knowledge workers. Knowledge workers are university trained, and they'll improve the economy with better jobs and paying more taxes. And there's also the notion of democratization of human capital. But in the 2008, the financial crisis and the sort of ongoing financial crisis of different states, funding has been cut back to, at least to the public universities. And those universities have to reorganize and cut expenditures and increase student fees. Now, the neoliberal agenda is not really working very well right now because of the small payback. I mean, and now it's even worse, especially with COVID. And there's also a sort of cost-benefit problem in terms of the investment into universities and what the payback actually is, right? And these sort of accountability problems come up and looking at outcomes and all sorts of issues. So there are these two models. Now, the third model I'm going to propose is the societal notion of knowledge as a public good. And this is where I talk about, this is Michael Crow's Arizona State University, right? And in his book, New American University, he writes about the research university should address the needs of society, and Crow has moved the ASU's ranking up the ranking to be one of the top innovative universities in the U.S. The other part of it, in terms of the societal notion, is to bring the university to more students with diverse backgrounds. I mean, these are some social justice issues, and to align teaching to accommodate students together with academic excellence. He's also changed, supposedly, ASU from a large public university to an adaptive knowledge enterprise. And in the book, The Fifth Wave, he he talks about frameworks for universal learning to permit individuals, regardless of their socioeconomic status or life situation, to gain knowledge and skills. Now, the question is this: I mean, even though this is a societal notion of knowledge as a public good, I mean, is this still neoliberalism operating in the background? Because you know, in terms of ASU, there are many private-public partnerships as well, right? So it's not just straight funding from the state, and the state of Arizona has cut funding to ASU, but there are many. There's a lot of involvement in industry as well. So there's another version, which is innovation coming from outside the university, right? And in terms of knowledge, and this is where DARPA comes in, right? Which is and DARPA, which has been featured on 60 Minutes, it's brought about virtual reality, drones, internet, and DARPA is government funded, but the ideas can come from any discipline, and from inside the university and outside the university. And you know, the innovation has come to you know, and the question then is whether the university is the best way for science to become a public good. So DARPA is very sort of interesting in that sense, and is very future oriented. Now, there's another version of innovation from outside the university, which is brought up by Donald Stokes in the Pasteur's Quadrant. I don't have any slides, so it's difficult to show Pasteur's Quadrant, but just you have to think about it in terms of a quadrant. And you have to the top left, which is you have pure research by Niels Bohr, and then you know, on the bottom right you have applied research by Edison. So Bohr did a lot of work in terms of work on but meanwhile in the other quadrant you have Edison. But then you have this third quadrant, which is up on top on the right, which is a user-inspired notion of research, which is by Pasteur. And Pasteur, his work was involved in terms of epidemiology, and it was use-inspired in terms of it came about because of a crisis, and it's also another notion of it could be, you could think about it in terms of Manhattan Project. So in terms of this, the innovation has come from outside of universities, right? So then the question is, what are the universities supposed to do? And in terms of, and I'll just conclude here, in terms of the knowledge produced at universities as public good or for public good has changed from the social democratic model to the neoliberal model. Now we also have ASU's model of supposedly the societal good model, and which has elements of neoliberalism in there. The innovation from coming outside the university doesn't really fit those two questions of knowledge for the public good, as public good, or for the public good. So what is the responsibility of the university then to produce knowledge? And my last point is this, which is really a question, is can university become certifiers of innovative knowledge produced outside of universities? And thank you, that's my talk. Over to you, Steve.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you all for showing up here. It turns out I'm in Germany, and it's getting close to midnight here, and so I won't try to keep you too long. At least not try to keep me too long. But I want to say something about there have been a range of topics that have been covered here, and I also want to add something else into the mix, but to sort of provide a certain amount of integration of what's going on. one way to begin this is to talk about why I'm here in Germany in the first place. And it's because there's now a new research institute at the University of Aachen, which is the largest polytechnic university in Germany. And they're interested in two things that have both come up in the talks that we've heard so far. So one of them has to do with the future of the university. And my project here in that regard is this idea of rebooting Humboldt, okay, a sort of Humboldt 2.0. And here's one thing I would say, and I think this is something that's been very useful in all of the three preceding talks, is that all of them had a thread going through them about the history of the university. And that's not a trivial point, because in fact, most academics don't know anything about the history of the university. And indeed, there is a kind of amnesia, like the university is kind of how you experience it now, but there is no sense of the backstory and the various changes that this institution has undergone. And just to give you a little anecdotal piece of evidence, when I recently proposed a book, which I am writing, which had the title Humboldt 2.0 for an higher education series, the editor was saying nobody will know who Humboldt is for higher education series, okay? And so that strikes, that gives you a sense, right? Because they're talking about who is the what do people in higher education know about, right? And maybe they've heard of Michael Crow because he's not dead yet. But the point is, it's not clear what they're going to be knowing about Humboldt or the Middle Ages or Johns Hopkins University or any of that kind of stuff, okay? So there is a kind of real issue here. And to be perfectly honest, STS isn't very good at this. STS has never really focused on the university as a site of knowledge production. It focuses on laboratories. It focuses on research networks very well. But given that a university, especially in the Humboldtian model, is about the integration of teaching and research, right? And Alcy in particular made a big deal about this in his talk, about this idea of the unity of teaching and research, and that being the unique feature of the modern university. This is something that is in a way missing from STS to a large extent. And it does go to some of the concerns that Bob was raising in the first talk, because one of the things that Bob is kind of the bee in his bonnet, you might say, is that he thinks that we produce too much knowledge, right? And it's certainly true that there's more knowledge produced than anyone ever reads or accesses or anything like that. That's certainly true. And so, one might say this does look a bit pointless. And given how much time as academics we spend doing this, right? But the thing about the Humboldtian University that was really important has to do with the relationship between research. In other words, research is not an end in itself. I mean, just because research is supposed to be free and you're supposed to follow the truth wherever it goes, that doesn't preclude you from having a kind of enlightenment mission on top of that, whereby you publicize this knowledge that you're pursuing freely. Right? So there's both sides of the equation here. It's not just about pursuing knowledge freely as long as you want, but it's also about publicizing it, and in particular, making it available to the next generation, okay? And that's the whole point of teaching, right? So in other words, people who were not involved in the original production of knowledge actually have an opportunity to receive it. And this means that you have to translate that knowledge in the classroom, so it is not put forward in the original technical terms that only a few people know, okay? And that was what the Humboldtian mission was about. That's how you would bring enlightenment into the institution of the university where it did not exist before. Because I think, as Alcy was especially pointing out, prior to the early 19th century, universities were primarily professional training grounds, right? They really were not about enlightening people in any kind of general way. And in fact, the Enlightenment was generally hostile to universities, okay? See, all of this history is really quite important and powerful if one is going to think about how one's going to legitimize the university in the future. Because I think things that all three previous speakers have made very clear is that the university is suffering from a legitimation crisis at many different levels, right? It's not so it's not just simply an issue of the university being part of the establishment in some sense. It's actually in lots of levels that the university's legitimacy is being challenged. And if one's going to defend it, right, one has to think about the grounds on which that's going to happen. So that's one project, and I think the previous three speakers brought the various issues involved up very well. The second project I'm working on, which relates probably most directly, I guess, to what Bob was saying and what Alcy was saying, is about the future of humanity. And all this stuff about the proactionary, precautionary, about the trans and post-human and all that, that's part of it too, because if we're talking about, let's say universities in the modern period, a la Humboldt, have been about training the human, right? It's got a humanistic mission, right? That was kind of, there was its image of the autonomous human modeled on a sort of Kantian view of the world, right? That was kind of the person that would come out of the university, a self-determining person who could speak for themselves and all the rest of it. Well, obviously, this idea has been challenged from many different fronts, okay? And indeed, we are now in a position, right, having a lot to do with the developments in technology, and Alcy, bringing up all the stuff, artificial intelligence, really, right, you in sense, right? And so post and from the standpoint of, let's say, what Bob was taught, right? Bob would be classed in my view as a kind of post. He's more generally ecological perspective, right? That is somewhat in a way it transcends the human, you might say, right? And the human is just part of that. But of course there is this about more, which actually would have us merge with this, kind of into a kind of new space. Now, all of that. Time do I have over time? How much more time do you say? Francis?
5 minutes.
Francis. Okay. Because I want to now get to the topic that is in the abstract. Okay, I realize I only have about 5 minutes. Is that the understanding, Alcy? Because you put your hand up there. Okay, and this has to do with kind of the post-truth situation and the role of expertise in all of this. Okay, I'll just make a general point at the outset that relates to this whole business about the future of the university. If we're talking about the idea of the university as involving the translation of cutting-edge research into a teaching environment where large numbers of students who don't have the same background as the researchers nevertheless get access to the knowledge, okay, there is a sense in which what's going on in the classroom is a deconstruction of expertise, okay? So this is one way to think about it. And this is why, in a sense, I am one of these people who's relatively comfortable with the post-truth condition insofar as the post-truth condition is anti-expertise. Because in fact, teaching ought to be about deconstructing expertise, okay? And about saying that there is ways of getting access to knowledge that doesn't require that you get a PhD, doesn't require that you write all these technical articles that go through peer review, blah, 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 right? But rather there are more direct ways of getting it. And it seems to me that the post-truth condition in a way really highlights this aspect of things, okay? And it is and the way I understand it is as a kind of byproduct of democratization. So in other words, contrary to a lot of the post-truth critics, right? So there are all these critics of post-truth, right? Most people who talk about post-truth don't like it, okay? And these people say somehow it's undermining democracy. Bullshit, okay? The post-truth condition is what democracy looks like. Okay, and the problem is the people who claim to be supporting democracy didn't realize what they'd got themselves into, right? So we've got a lot of academic people, the Habermasians of the world, these people, right, whose ideas of democracy are basically for well-toned, well-spoken people, right, who follow the rules, respect the experts, and all the rest of it, okay? No, no, this is not democracy. It might be your fantasy of a democracy, but it's not what real democracy looks like. And it's one reason why a lot of the people who've thought seriously about democracy in the modern era, and here I would say John Stuart Mill had a lot of, and that's why he wanted things like weighted votes in parliament so that the smart people counted more. Because, I mean, okay, so he wanted to preserve a certain amount of elitism, right, within what he was seeing as an emerging democratic culture where more people were being allowed to vote. Okay, let's have more people vote, but don't let all their votes count the same, right? This is John Stuart Mill, and this is what he meant by protecting the minority. Who are these minority? The smart people. He's not talking about women, blacks, etc. He's talking about the experts. Okay, and if you actually dig a little bit deeper into a lot of all of these so-called democratic theorists of the modern era, they all have this kind of get-out clause, where at the end of the day, they don't really want to respect people, as it were, taking knowledge into their own hands and making their own judgments. This is the kind of, in a way, what the post-truth condition does is to kind of bring all this out into the open, right? And this has a lot of very important consequences, it seems to me, in terms of, in particular, how academics reposition themselves in this environment. Because whatever we're going to be in the future, right, we cannot be these know-it-all experts of the past. Right? There's going to have to be a different kind of social positioning of the academic if universities are going to survive at all. Okay, and there's a very interesting conversation to be had about that. But it's going to be quite different, right? A quite different look from the way, and so things like credentialing, which Alcee was making reference to, a lot of that's going to disappear. Okay, a lot of this business of credentialing, the reason why people go to universities today in some way to get a license to get a job, right? A lot of that is going to be, bullshit from the past. That's going to disappear. We're going to need universities primarily to train people, kind of like in the way I think most of the speakers were talking about, for people to stand up for themselves and to think for themselves. What universities are going to ultimately be good at is a kind of liberal arts curriculum. That's the only thing that you can be sure will survive in this kind of political transformation that we're undergoing as a result of knowledge being so generally available. And I'll stop there, okay? And we can have some discussion. Is that okay?
Thank you, Steve. So who has raised their hand or has a question? So, Britt, you have a lot of questions from in the chat. Do you want to talk about it directly?
I guess I was just sort of typing stuff as Steve was talking. I'm sorry I missed Bob's talk. I was trying to search for you guys. My search wasn't working. I do not like these virtual conferences. But I was just commenting as Steve was talking. So it's not really questions so much. I'm sort of agreeing with what's been said, but also trying to be a little integrative as well, and was tying in some of the things that Steve was saying, and kind of didn't get to about expertise. They do tie together, right? And I think this is right. And so the first comment I made was about the students and the role that the students have. The way that Steve presented it was kind of more from the point of view of the professor, and in some sense that the professor had this sort of obligation to spread enlightenment to the students. But for Humboldt, it seems to me like it's very much two-way, right? Mm-hmm. And that the students play a role in improving knowledge production as well. And this ties in with the democratization of knowledge. It's like Humboldt really had that point there in the first place, freedom right? From the very beginning. And this also then, to me, sort of tied in with the point that Alcee was making about how philosophy might be the thing for people to learn in the future, the most important thing for people to learn. And as Steve was saying, how universities, the future of the universities is this sort of liberal arts education. It all does seem to tie together well to me.
Yeah, it's the freedom to teach and the freedom to learn. This was the Humboldtian slogan, right? So you're absolutely right, Britt, that in a sense, the students had the obligation, their duty was to learn in whatever way they want. The professor's just putting stuff out there, right? They don't have to, in a sense, they don't have to really take it that seriously, right? They just have to be their own inquirers as well. And the professor is just there as kind of a model for what it's like to engage in free inquiry, right? So it is a freedom to learn. You're absolutely right. It's a freedom to teach and a freedom to learn.
I too think that it's likely that universities in the future will return to their 19th or early 20th century focus on the humanities and philosophy of the humanities. But there's an element, and so I'm sympathetic to a lot of the points being made. But there was a kind of elision in Steve's argument. We have gotten our dose of democracy in the last 5 or 10 years via Mark Zuckerberg and social media, and we've seen what it's like. And so my comment about Plato, which I assume people picked up on, that's where we need to go in this conversation. There's a significant cohort of people who are not interested and or do not have the ability to study philosophy or to get a college education, whether it's technical or humanistic. And this body will be susceptible to the Trumps of the world, whether it's in Hungary, the United States, or elsewhere.
Can I say something in response to that?
Sure, please.
I think that may be true as a kind of a short-term thing, but that's kind of, I mean, there's a kind of collective learning experience with regard to democracy. And while it's true that some demagogues might be able to take advantage of the situation in the short term, I think in the long term, people learn, right? I mean, that might be small consolation for the casualties along the way in the short term. But I do think that there is a kind of trial and error aspect and a kind of growing pains aspect to any kind of democratization. So yes, I think in a sense what Bob is saying empirically is probably correct, that their demagogues will be able to take advantage of stuff in the short term, but people will learn not to be taken advantage of. I mean, I think that is kind of the long term. Otherwise, you just don't believe in democracy, right? You just sort of say, forget about democracy, right? Too many casualties.
Well, yeah, and perhaps you and I disagree on this point, Steve. The trouble with social media is, as you suggested, that it's shown us the truth of democracy, where you have anti-vaxxers chanting at people trying to walk their kids with masks on in Tennessee. But perhaps where we differ is that you end up being an Enlightenment person, where in a way that I, sadly, I mean, this is not a conclusion I like at all, am not. That not only will we always have the poor with us, we will always have the uneducable among us. There will always be 40% of the population who are either incapable or unwilling to become educated and to be discerning reasoners. And that's the kind of facts that our technological innovations and our political institutions cannot take account of yet.
I think someone else should be talking at this point. I mean, clearly Bob and I disagree.
Aria, do you have a question?
Sure. Thank you all for a really riveting way to sort of end the day and allow us to sort of reflect on not just I think the topic of this session, but a conference, even if virtual, as sort of an artifact or production of academic and sort of research oriented professions. I was struck a little bit by obviously by a lot of the content, but even coming into the session by the fact that at least 2 or 3 of the presenters were independent researchers, and I'm sort of at the point in my career where I'm sort of finishing my first postdoc, but actually feeling very strongly of leaving the formal academic institution, but taking with me, by virtue of having been within both the physical and the methodological and theoretical structures of a university for most of my life. So taking some of the methods, approaches, ways of inquiry with me, in addition to some of the technical skills that will certainly have to be modernized and updated going forward. But finding, in a sense, in part at least, the topic of the session, challenge to expertise, but also challenge to what I'm finding the metrics and the measurement of success within the institutionalization of universities as somewhat counterproductive to, I think, that freedom to teach and the freedom to learn, both for students and for not just faculty, but also those who sort of fit in the midst of that spectrum. So I'm curious, both in terms of the choices you've made in your various trajectories, but also if you can reflect on sort of the some of those issues of how we measure and how that can in a sense also negatively impact sort of this Humboldtian tradition.
So
why don't the independent scholars, friends, that's you and Bob.
yeah. So Bob, do you want to speak to that?
I've been silenced by Steve, so
Oh, come on. I'm
job.
sure you have lots to say.
Yeah, I have too much to say on this topic.
Well, I mean, I could tell you, not in terms on the university level, but I mean the skills that you bring from the university to the private sector or to government or any other sector are huge, right? And that some people find that, especially university politics. I mean, that's a big can of worms right there. It's terrible, right? Not that the work world is actually better, but it may be a bit fairer. I mean, that's all I'm going to say. Go ahead, Elsie. You muted. Elsie.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
For Professor Fuller, this question regarding the future of higher education, you speak of a role for universities and presumably colleges as well as kind of guardians or gatekeepers of second order knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And as well, you talk about them being the experts of liberal arts. So how is it that these are connected, how they pan out? How is it that they could be recognized as authorities of this second order knowledge? How would this flesh out?
Okay, I'll answer that because you're bringing in something that, in a sense, it's really hasn't been that this way of putting things hasn't been yet discussed in this context. But I want to say something to Aria before, as kind of the dinosaur professor, I guess, of this panel, is that if I were starting out my career now, right? So I got my PhD in 1985, when the going was still good. I would not go into academia today, okay? In fact, what I would probably do, given my interests, and I wanted to channel my interests, I would probably go into the creative industries, media of some sort. And I do think for people who have a kind of very strong kind of intellectual interest of the sort that would attract them to do sustained research and so forth, if they also become adept in kind of multimedia technologies as ways of being able to, promote various ideas in lots of different ways, right? I mean, that can be a very satisfying and rewarding career, actually. And I would say that now, because the creative industries have become much more prominent, and here, the internet has a lot to do with that too, right? More people are involved. And it's much more of a moneymaker as well, of course. That's kind of where I would position the interest I had back in the 70s and 80s if I were coming out, with a PhD now. So in a way, that's kind of the way I would kind of address your question. Now, with regard to this point Alcy is making, I will just say something quick because I don't know how much more time we have, but I don't want to. I'm not. But I do think. So what he's talking about, what he's referring to, is a question I kind of left open in my talk. Is exactly what is it? What is a university for? Right, in this kind of new world that we're entering into. And there is a way in which I've characterized it, which is the second order knowledge. In other words, people can find knowledge all over the place, right? You go in the internet and you get all kinds of information and so forth. And what a university education might be able to do is, what I mean by second order is a kind of connoisseurship. In other words, what you can be taught is, as it were, I'm going to put it crudely, how do you tell the good from the bad stuff, right? In other words, a certain kind of discernment, a certain kind of judgment, right? But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to you how you exercise that judgment. But it seems to me that's the kind of thing that should be the focus of a kind of liberal arts oriented university, a kind of teaching of discernment or judgment rather than teaching content, or because this idea of delivering content, I think that's completely obsolete notion. Universities shouldn't be involved in that. Right? People can get content from anywhere, right? Alcy's point about the PowerPoints and all that was really well taken. And so I think, though, what the universities can do is about connoisseurship. It's about discernment. It's about judgment, which is very much what the original Humboldtian idea was. Okay, I mean, if you read Kant and all these people in Kant's tradition, the German idealists, they talk a lot about judgment. Okay, judgment is the name of the game for all these people, and it is comparable to a kind of aesthetic sensibility, right? How do you put different kinds of ideas together? How do you put different kinds of facts together? How do you come up with a kind of coherent worldview, right? This is something that the university can be good at, right? It's a kind of special thing, though. It's not an all-purpose knowledge economy thing, but it's a quite special sort of thing, and that's kind of what I meant.
So we put back creativity via arts and philosophy for critical thinking, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, this is the thing. Yes, I mean, I do think. See, this is why I'm quite sanguine about the future of the humanities in a broad sense, if the humanities fully embrace the multimedia environment in which we live. Right? I think there's actually quite a lot of space for the humanities. In fact, just like the modern university was based on the humanities, that's going to be what remains. I think that's what's made the university.
So we shouldn't subscribe ourselves to one medium of.
That's right, exactly.
We should be.
I really think the multimedia thing is really important. I think a real problem that the modern university has had, and this is why so many students get turned off by it, is it does privilege a certain kind of text way of operating, right? And it's not just the text in per se, but it's a certain kind of writing. Right? I mean, if you think about how students' papers get marked, I mean, the way the kind of things that we're in fact reinforcing in our pedagogical practices, right, undermines the appreciation for a multimedia world in which people are living.
Good point. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In the chat here from Laura. What might be the potential to combine technological and humanities in future education? What role might multimedia transdisciplinarity have for the future?
Oh, the question in the box.
Yeah.
I see. Yes. Well, I think it's very positive, actually, and I think it's already happening. I think universities need to embrace it more, but I'm very pro that. Yeah, I'm surprised there's even any kind of opposition to it.
If it's possible to just sort of maybe put a hook into sort of Laura's question. What was always striking, or what has been striking, is whenever you have or during the periods in the last 20 or odd years where you had economic constrictions, these stories emerge of humanities programs being sort of the first to be cut, and to some extent that reflects some of the the way administrators or funders see the value of particular programs, and some of that has to do, of course, with broader the relationship between funding research and particularly private donor funding of research, and metrics like, for example, employment X months after graduation, where particular technical fields just tend to do better. So this notion of whether it's sort of the current COVID crisis or during economic compressions, obviously the role of the humanities, the role of sort of even reconciling, understanding the broad spectrum of humanities is sort of very central to maintaining it's sort of and promoting if not a technical solutions, but really sort of a collective social either sort of coming together or identifying some of the perhaps blind spots or gaps. But why? How do we reconcile sort of this reflexivity? Is it simply just getting money out of these institutions? Is it a broader sort of pedagogical preoccupation with certain technical fields?
Well, I mean, you know, this is something I think a lot of people could speak to. Way in which people who run universities think about the institutions they're running, okay? And I do think this is where the corporate mentality of universities kind of really takes over at this point, which tends to kind of privilege these sorts of metrics that you're talking about, and also privileges a kind of massification mentality, okay? You know, which wants more buildings, more stuff, more money, right? Everything just grows. And that is really the wrong way to look at it. And to be honest with you, I don't think it's sustainable. And here I resonate a bit with what Bob was saying in his opening talk. I don't think universities can grow indefinitely. You know, just like corporations end up exploding, they become a bubble unto themselves. I mean, people are already predicting the whole university sector is a big bubble that's about to burst, right? And you know, part of what, you know, if you think about some of the things that Alcy was talking about in his talk about the fact that, you know, you're getting now in-house credentialing processes where you know, accounting firms, whatever, you know, just are bypassing university degrees as being necessary at all for getting jobs. They will conduct their own examinations. I mean, accounting firms are doing that already, right? Where people who you know, so at some point, a lot of these kind of cash cow degree programs might just get replaced because they're not as efficient from the standpoint of actually providing the kind of knowledge needed to take up a certain kind of job than just the in-house training could provide in the business, you see? And so I do think universities are turning into big bubbles that are going to burst at some point. And that's why once they burst, right, what's going to be left? Right? After the bubble bursts, what's going to be left? And this is what the argument for the humanities is. It will be going back to fundamentals. Right? It'll be the Great Reformation, as I like to think about it. We will go back to the fundamentals.
So there's a point in the chat that I see more tech and humanities conjunctions happening in industry than academia. Tristan Harris, for example.
Well, I do. Okay, so to explain that is because the universities this is where the universities are in self-destruct mode. It is the ossification of the disciplinary boundaries within universities that actually make the kinds of relevant crossovers difficult within the university culture, okay? That is the problem. In that respect, industry has an advantage because industry tends to be quite, you know, compared to academia, isn't as, you know, sort of regionalized epistemologically or ontologically, right? I mean, there's a sense in the university, we have very clear distinctions, at least in our minds, about what is humanities, what is social science, what is natural sciences, what is technology. And so you actually have to bridge all these things within the university culture in order to get these appropriate hybrid things to take place. Whereas in industry, those disciplinary boundaries place, and that's why there's a temporary advantage, at least that industry has in this matter. It is really to the disadvantage of universities, though. Yeah, how might it be? How can you deossify the disciplines? Well, I think it's going to happen. Let's put it this way: it's going to happen when the bubble bursts, because disciplinary boundaries are just not sustainable. Very few disciplinary programs can really carry on indefinitely.
So what about what's happening in China and Asia? I mean, in China, the universities are expanding, like there are many universities being built and expanding like crazy. How will those universities be? What would happen to them in the future?
Well, I mean, again, others may want to speak to this as well. I tend to see those developments as kind of part of what, in fact, was very much part of the original German motivation for taking up Humboldt with gusto in the 19th century, and that is nation building. Right, Alcee was making reference to that in his talk about because Humboldt has an idea, it works at the University of Berlin, but why does it scale up? Right? Why does it scale up in the way it does, so that Germany becomes, from being a backwater, disorganized place in the early 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, is the leading scientific power in the world. Okay, so this is what I think is going on, is a kind of the nation building aspect, right? That is happening outside of the West at the moment. Okay, it's happening in a very particular way. So I'm not going to be sort of romantic about this and say that somehow the Chinese are Humboldtian, but I do think that the idea of using the university as a way of kind of scaling up your society, right? Raising the level of human capital in a very fast way, right? I think that was one of the consequences of the expansion of the Humboldtian University in 19th century Germany, for sure.
And Francis, Chinese are also valuing the arts and critical thinking more and more and more. So no longer just copying, what Westerners are doing. No, they are into creativity and critical thinking for their students as well. So there is a wave there that is happening. So it might happen that a reformation might happen partly there, And there's a finalization, at least kind of a situation there going on. The state putting clearly science towards the solution of certain problems, ailments of society. So, instead of the market, dictating, the state dictates, So in that sense, they might be ahead to some extent, at least into what happens in the future. Look at electric vehicles, They have how many? 25, Like in terms of ecological, measures, they're way ahead of everybody else, Ask Elon Musk. He's complaining about it all the time.
Yeah, China's doing both, unfortunately. China is also still a leader in the production of carbon emissions at the same time that it's pioneering all these electric cars.
Maybe they need to, So yeah. Well, because they're being ethical, because they need to survive too. Yes, sir.
So there's a point.
There's lots of stuff going on here in the chat. I mean, it's just hard to catch up.
Yeah, exactly. So Laura is saying that she would like to see universities incentivize inter and transdisciplinary research. Much of research funding, promotion, and academia is structured around disciplines and specialized knowledge. Anyone have any comments on that?
Yeah, and just on, sorry, I know it's for speakers. I don't want to take up the time, but just to add again onto to that comment on almost sort of in defense of certain sort of disciplinary traditions, or at least the not the content that is captured, but the method of inquiry and maybe the rich tapestry of theoretical orientations that actually allow, for example, similar to certain technical fields, two people to be able to understand each other and have referential points that allow them to be able to find perhaps deeper nuances in particular around particular challenges or particular questions or issues. To the question Vanya's posing around sort of inter-transdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, there's been this sort of this moving goalpost of what's become sexy in academia. Of it started with multidisciplinarity and then interdisciplinarity, and now people think they're doing transdisciplinarity, and most places that are advocating for transdisciplinarity are absolutely not doing that. Transdisciplinarity has very particular meanings, so defending or at least finding the value in disciplinary pedagogy and methods and theories, but similar to a lot of the advocacy for whether it's industry or the creative fields of where there is an openness to alternative approaches, alternative methods, alternative media mediums for exploring a question. Is it possible to sort of rectify or have those sort of opposable ideas, or is there sort of a difference, or is it possible to reconcile them?
Well, you want to take a shot at that, Francis?
Or
do you
anyone
want
else want to take a shot? Elsie, Bob?